Imagine a war that lasted over a century, a conflict that spanned generations. Welcome to the Hundred Years' War. A tumultuous period in history, this war was a series of conflicts that raged from 1337 to 1453. Its roots traced back to an English claim to the French throne, a bold assertion that threw two great nations into a bitter struggle for power. It was a time when the world was changing, when ideas of nationhood and identity were beginning to emerge, and it was these forces that fueled this century-long war. It was more than just a battle for a throne. It was a struggle for identity, for sovereignty, for the very soul of two nations. The English, driven by their monarch's claim to the French crown, were not merely fighting for a title. They were fighting for a future, for a legacy that would echo through the ages. On the other side, the French were not merely defending their throne, they were defending their home, their nation, their very way of life. This wasn't a war that was fought in a few years or even a few decades. It stretched over 100 years, across multiple generations. Fathers passed on the fight to their sons, who in turn passed it on to their sons. The battlefields may have changed, the soldiers may have changed, but the war raged on, relentless and unyielding. And as the war continued, it grew, it evolved. It was no longer just about a claim to a throne, it became a broader struggle, a struggle fueled by emerging nationalism, a struggle for the very identity of two nations. The lines were drawn not just on maps, but in the hearts and minds of the people. Thus began a war of epic proportions, a struggle that would change the face of Europe. Enjoying this deep dive into the Hundred Years' War? Give us a like and consider subscribing for more fascinating history content. Stay with us as the story unfolds. In this grand tapestry of conflict, three threads of war can be discerned. The first thread, the Edwardian War, was the initial phase of the Hundred Years' War. This phase, named after King Edward III of England, was marked by English claims to the French throne. The English, taking advantage of the political instability in France, enjoyed early successes. However, despite these victories, the war was far from over. This phase set the stage for the protracted conflict that would unfold, underscoring the deep-seated tensions between the two nations. Next, we find the thread of the Caroline War. This phase, named after Charles V of France, was characterized by a shift in momentum. The French, under the astute leadership of Charles, began to reclaim their territories. This phase marked a turning point in the war, as the French gradually recovered their lands, reversing the early English victories. The Caroline War demonstrated the resilience and strategic prowess of the French, setting the stage for the final phase of the war. The last thread, the Lancastrian War, named after the House of Lancaster, saw the English revive the conflict under the leadership of Henry V. Despite initial success, including the famous Battle of Agincourt, the tide turned once again in favour of the French. The Siege of Orléans, led by the inspirational figure Joan of Arc, marked a decisive victory for the French. This phase culminated in the Treaty of Arras, marking the end of the war. These threads, intertwined, form the complex narrative of the Hundred Years' War. Each phase, with its unique strategies, victories and defeats, contributed to the overall narrative of the war. They highlight the ebb and flow of power, the ever-changing fortunes of war, and the indomitable spirit of the nations involved. Each phase, a chapter in this century-long saga, added a new dimension to the war. In the grand chessboard of war, fortunes fluctuate. The Hundred Years' War was no exception to this rule. As the conflict evolved, it saw both England and France claim victories and suffer defeats, a true testament to the unpredictable nature of warfare. The early stages of the war were marked by a string of English successes. Their tactics, coupled with a strong leadership, created a momentum that the French found difficult to counter. England's victories were not just on the battlefield, but also in the courtrooms of Europe, as they cleverly maneuvered to strengthen their claims to the French crown. However, as the war progressed, the French began to regain their footing. They didn't just recapture their lost territories, but they also started to challenge the English hold on French lands. This period of French resurgence was not just a result of their military might, but also due to the internal disarray in the English ranks. The reign of Charles VI of France was plagued by civil unrest and personal turmoil. His bouts of mental illness further complicated the situation in France. However, this very instability provided England with a window of opportunity. Under the leadership of Henry V, England revived their campaign, capitalizing on the chaos that had engulfed their adversaries. Henry V's reign marked a new phase in the conflict. His military strategies and diplomatic skills breathed new life into the English campaign. However, this period of English resurgence was not to last. The French, under the Valois dynasty, were preparing a counter-offensive that would change the course of the war. Yet the tides of war were about to turn, heralding a new era in the conflict. The 100 Years' War was far from over. As the war moved into its final stages, the balance of power would shift once again, setting the stage for a dramatic conclusion. Every war has its climax, and the 100 Years' War was no exception. The endgame of this century-long conflict was marked by a succession of French victories that shifted the tide of the war decisively in favor of the Valois dynasty. The Siege of Orléans serves as a pivotal moment in this endgame. This significant military confrontation saw the French forces, under the command of the charismatic Joan of Arc, successfully lift the English siege of the city. This victory was a turning point, not only in terms of military strategy, but also in terms of morale. The French, who had been on the back foot for so long, now found a renewed sense of hope and determination. But the Siege of Orléans was not the only victory that the French enjoyed. The endgame was marked by a series of French successes, each one chipping away at the English grip on continental Europe. This period saw the French forces regain control of Paris, Rouen, and several other key territories. The English, on the other hand, found their fortunes in a steady decline. Despite their initial successes and their strong claim to the French throne, they were unable to maintain their momentum. The English were eventually left with only one continental possession, the port city of Calais. This was a stark contrast to the vast territories they had once controlled in France. The endgame of the 100 Years' War was not just about military victories and territorial gains. It was also about the shifting dynamics of power and the emergence of strong national identities. The war had started with English claims to the French throne, but it ended with the French firmly in control of their own destiny. The English, for their part, had to contend with the loss of their continental landholdings and the dissatisfaction of their nobles. These factors would later contribute to another significant conflict, the Wars of the Roses. And so the war that had raged for over a century finally found its end. The 100 Years' War, a conflict that had shaped the course of European history, had finally reached its conclusion. But its echoes would be felt for centuries to come. Wars leave scars, but they also sow seeds of change. The 100 Years' War, a conflict that spanned over a century, left an indelible mark on European history. It was more than just a clash of swords and shields. It was a catalyst for change that propelled an entire continent into a new era. The echoes of this war were not merely heard in the form of clashing steel, but in the innovations it spurred in military technology and tactics. The era of knights in shining armor and chivalry was slowly replaced by the rise of the longbow and artillery. The face of warfare was forever changed, with the battlefield no longer ruled by the knightly class, but by whoever wielded the most effective weapon. Yet, the impact of the war was not confined to the battlefield. It seeped into the fabric of society, shaping national identities. England and France, once embroiled in a bitter struggle for dominance, emerged from the war with a stronger sense of nationhood. The war sparked a flame of nationalism that would define the next centuries of European history. However, the war also left a trail of economic devastation in its wake. Once thriving trade routes were disrupted, leading to a decline in commerce. Civil disorder was rampant as societies grappled with the economic fallout of a century-long conflict. Yet, from the ashes of war, new systems and structures emerged. The war necessitated the creation of standing armies, a concept that would shape the future of military organization. It also led to political upheaval and reform, setting the stage for modern concepts of governance and statehood. In the aftermath of the 100 Years' War, Europe was forever transformed. The scars of the conflict served as reminders of the past, but they also paved the way for the future. The echoes of the war continued to reverberate through the centuries, shaping the course of history in ways that were unimaginable at the onset of the conflict. The 100 Years' War, a testament to human resilience, forever changed the course of history.